this month's tutorial is going to focus on a few tricks that will help you keep the likeness and proportions of your characters fixed as you move them into different poses. Let's get started. The way that I'm organizing this video is that I'm going to talk about some basic theory to character design first, then I'm going to show you guys some practical examples of what I mean when, when I talk about theory, and then I'm going to do a live demo at the end of the video. So I hope that this will be useful for you guys to kind of like understand the problem at the start and then being able to apply it to your own art. So, of course, we all know about basic shapes. Basic shapes are a circle, a square, and a triangle. The square can also be a rectangle. We're talking in general terms here. So these basic shapes are what makes up 100% of faces. Like every face is made up by these three single elements. Even if you want to draw in a more realistic way, these are still what is at the basis of every face. So whenever you approach a face, if you have done the character design or if you're trying to replicate someone else's character design, you have to first understand what is the relation between these shapes, what is the proportion between these shapes, because that it basically gives the different likeness of every person. Some people have very long, very big upper faces, which are made up by the circle. Some people have very pointy chins, which means that they have very pointy triangles, which is the lower part of the face. Some people have very big necks, which are the rectangle part. The relationship between these three elements, as I was saying, is what gives every single person their unique features and therefore their unique proportions. The trick to repeating that person's face in many different poses is to always keep those proportions regular and consistent, basically.
Hey, editing memo here from the future. I just wanted to remind you guys that this would be a good time to do the thing. The thing. Just like and subscribe this video if you like it, if you're enjoying it. This will let me know that you would like to see more content like this in the future. Thanks, and enjoy watching the rest of the video.
The first step in training your eye to recognize what are the basic shapes that make up each person's face from reference is to gather some references, as I'm doing here. Then you can lower the opacity of the references, create a new layer on top, and choose 3 different colors for each shape. So here I chose red for the circle, green for the triangle, and blue for the rectangle. But you can choose different ones. Just go over each reference photo and try and recognize, so draw on top of it, what are the shapes and how they interact with each other, pretty much. So as you can see, I'm using the circle to identify the top part of the head, the skull. I'm using the triangle to identify the jaw, and then I am using the rectangle to identify the neck. These 3 shapes interact with each other in a way that is interconnected. The rectangle actually goes inside the skull, it kind of like inserts itself at the back of the skull, and the jaw is attached to the rest of the skull, the circle. But let's try and, simplify as much as possible. This is a very good exercise because it will help you to visualize how difficult references or how, people from real life can be broken down and easily drawn up in a cartoony way later on. So the second step to this exercise, let's see it as a modification of the exercise once you master the first part, is to turn those flat shapes into 3D shapes. As you can see here, I'm drawing a 3D grid of these shapes. So the circle has become a sphere, the triangle becomes a pyramid, and the rectangle becomes a cuboid. This is because people's faces, like anything about people, as I never tire to say, are physical, objects. They have volume, they have mass. So this is very important to remember, even if you draw in a very cartoony style, and even more important if you draw in a more realistic style. So what you can do is to take the same exercise as before, but try and understand what is the 3D volumes of these faces. How do these shapes, which are still simplified, but how do they interact in a more 3D manner? So you can draw these curved grids, and I think this will really help you later on to understand how these shapes, how these volumes interact with each other. Okay, so let's move on to exercise 3. As you can see here, I've gathered some references from popular character design. We have Mickey Mouse, Belle from Beauty and the Beast, and Cusco from The Emperor's New Groove. Of course, these are cartoony characters, so the proportions might not be exactly the same as what we were used to from the reference pictures. I'm using red for the circle and trying to identify where do circles come into play into Mickey Mouse's face. And I just realized that he doesn't have a neck, so he does not have a rectangle apparently on his face, but never mind. He does have plenty of triangles. His mouth is a triangle, and the sides of his face are pretty much triangles. They're pointy things. If you move to a character that is a little bit more realistic, more anthropomorphic, you can see, for example, Belle here. She respects the proportions that we found in the reference pictures a lot more. She has a circle for the top skull, a triangle for the jaw, and a rectangle for the neck. Same thing for Cusco, but in his case, as you can see, it's very interesting because the relationship between the circle and the triangle, so the top skull and the lower part of the face, the jaw, is completely different from Belle. Belle is very top-heavy in terms of face, which is something that is shared among most princesses because it makes a character look more cute, more endearing, whilst Cusco has a very small top head, top skull, and instead a very long triangle for the jaw. This makes Cusco's character a little bit more cartoony and gives him a lot more personality. So as you can see, it's identifying these shapes and then keeping them fixed in different poses that gives you the likeness that you're looking for. Now let's have a look at a couple of character designs that I developed a few weeks ago for a new book that I'm working on. The main characters are two siblings who solve mysteries. The youngest is a girl called Lisa. She's fierce and determined, while the oldest is a boy named Luca, who isn't. He just gets really spooked, but goes along with the adventures for the sake of his little sister. So aside from the reasoning behind the character design that I chose to create, let's analyze their face shapes with the method that we've used before. As you can see, Lisa's face is made up by a very large or almost perfect circle, under which is attached a small pointy triangle for the jaw and a very small rectangle for the neck. So she is incredibly top-heavy, as we were saying about Belle before. Almost all of her face is made up by the really big circle. I'm sure if you have followed any character design classes, you probably know about the archetypal reasoning behind using triangles instead of circles or, rectangles and squares. So you can probably see how I decided to use this big circle to keep the naivety and, the kind of like childlike wonder of the character. But also then she has a very decisive little triangle at the bottom to signify how she's determined, she's fierce, etc., etc. One thing that I like to do when I decide the shapes for my character is not only to create these circle, triangle, and rectangle grid shapes, but also to fill them in with color. And this is going to come in handy later on when we move on to the live practice, so do remember that. Let's move on to Luca's design. So Luca is similar to Lisa. Of course, they do have to have some sort of likeness between each other because they're siblings. So I went for an equally large circle for the top skull, but as you can see, it's slightly more oval, it's slightly more oblonged than Lisa's that is more regular. This is because that way I can give Luca a slightly more vertical build to his face, which signifies that he's a little bit older as well, and also works well, I think, with the hair on top that creates another layer of, height. And I think that works well with how skinny and how long his legs are in comparison, but that's another another, character design concern more than just trying to keep the likeness consistent. So as you can see, he's got a very oval-shaped skull. Then he has a rounded triangle for the jaw, and then a slightly longer, slightly bigger rectangle for his neck. And as you can see here, I'm drawing in the filled-in shapes of his face as well. And the reason why I do this is because this way I can use it as a sort of reference grid to counter-check each pose and make sure at the very first glance that the basic shapes and interaction between the proportions are keeping consistent. Okay, so now let's move on to do some practice. Here I have one of the reference photos from before. Let's use it to create a new character. I want to quickly sketch out a cartoony version of this girl. I'm not going for any specific aesthetic or style, just pretty much my usual style, which is Disney, leaning perhaps a little bit more towards cartoony in most recent times. So the main features that I want to enhance are this girl's cornrows, which I'm going to stylize even more, literally turning them into little strings. I also really love her big eyes and generous mouth, so I'm going to exaggerate those features as well. I find that when you do a cartoony version of a real person's portrait, you have to use some of the basics of caricature drawing and really exaggerate this person's most noticeable attributes. Where, as character designers, we differ from caricature artists is that a caricature artist is always trying to use these exaggerated features for humor or to poke fun. While in character design, we are trying to create appeal, so the features have to be exaggerated, but still be pleasant or at least to be in harmony with the whole. Anyway, I am now reasonably happy with this result, so I'm going to divide up the face with the same method that I used before, using a circle for the top head, a triangle for the jaw, and a rectangle for the neck. I'm going to draw these on a separate layer and further mark the area each specific facial feature holds, like, for example, the space of the forehead, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, etc. The reason why I'm doing this on a different layer is that then, later on, I can move it around and place it on top or next to the new drawings that I'm doing to reference check the new poses and make sure that the ratio, the proportion of these facial features stays the same. The first pose I drew was a 3/4 pose, which is a good, easy, natural pose for me to start. Starting with straight-on poses can be a bit traumatic in my experience, especially since it's hard to get both sides of the face completely symmetrical. Personally, I find it a little stiff to start with those ones, so 3/4 poses just seem a very natural place to start for me, but of course, you're free to start with something else. My next pose will be the straight-on pose, and then I'll draw a side profile pose. This is so I have a good reference of how the character looks in these 3 basic poses, and then from there you can move on to more challenging poses like up and down tilts, 3/4 back, etc, etc. As you can see, I started by putting down the basic shapes very roughly. This is because by using these bright colors and filled-in shapes, you have an immediate visual check of the proportions of the 3 parts of the face. Basically the same thing I was talking about when I was showing you my previous character design. They may not be 100% accurate, but it's a good start. After this, you can lower the opacity of the shapes and create a new layer with the rough sketch, starting with the face construction. I always mark the middle lines both vertical and horizontal when I start. When you're done with the construction, you can move your little reference sheet of where each facial feature is located and put it next to the new pose. You can then trace a new chart on top of it to make sure that you're keeping the correct proportions. Kind of like a ruler, basically. Of course, you have to check that the shape of the individual features, the shape of the eyes, of the mouth, etc., is also correct, on top of being in the correct place. This is why it helps if you develop a specific way of drawing things. First, it will become part of your style and make your drawings more recognizable. Secondly, it will become second nature to always draw a certain feature in a specific way, therefore making the characters more similar regardless of the pose. Of course, each character will be a little different, with smaller or bigger eyes, different shapes, etc. But the blueprint is still there. You just have to tweak it according to the different character. I notice this, for example, especially when I draw eyes. So I always draw eyes pretty much in the same way. The way that I draw eyelashes, for example, is very similar. I have 2 or 3 different ways that I draw eyelashes, and usually that is according to the style and feeling that I want to convey with a specific drawing. So, of course, each character will have slightly different eyes, more almond shaped, bigger, rounder, smaller, but the workflow is there, the way that I draw the eyes, the steps that I take to draw the eyes are always the same. As you can see, I'm repeating the same process for the side view of the character, simply tilting the grid a little to make it fit the pose. And actually, by doing this, I've noticed that the lower part of the face is very much out of proportions. So already I can make some changes to make sure that the character's ratio stays the same. To make these changes, don't bother erasing and redrawing, just use the lasso tool or select tool according to your software of choice to simply scale or distort the offending area until it fits the grid. Okay, so now that I have my 3 main poses, I'm going to go freestyle. If you're not feeling confident enough to go without the grid at this point, it's totally okay. You can keep using the grid and move it around next to each new pose to check the proportions, basically repeating the same steps we just used in the previous segment. If the perspective of the face changes because of the tilt of the head, you can distort or warp your grid on top of the new pose to make sure it's fitting the new angle. But if you do want to give freestyle a try, there are still more tricks to make sure you're not going completely off-road. There are things called landmarks. These are basically visible physical features that can help you direct your hand. For example, here I'm using the fact that the top of the ear is on the same level as the top of the eye to trace a grid line and define where the eyes should be placed without using the full chart. Remember that these guidelines are always rounded because the face is a 3D volume, namely a sphere, and therefore the guidelines need to follow its shape exactly as I showed you at the beginning of the video, in the 3D reference tracing part. Another landmark in the second freestyle pose is the pointy shape of the cheek. The pointier, most extruding part of the cheek is also on the same level as the bottom of the nose. So that's easily something that you can check to make sure that you're placing the nostrils on the right level, for example. As you can see, these are pretty rough sketches. The most important thing is to get the ratio, the proportion of these 3 interacting parts of the face right at the start. You can worry about clean lines at a later stage. Let's try something a little more challenging. Let's try a different expression. If you want to go more in depth about expressions, by the way, you should check out a tutorial from last year where I talk specifically about that. It's on Patreon somewhere, so you just need to search for the hashtag tutorial or monthly tutorial and you'll find it. Here we have a different pose with a different expression, so it's kind of compounding the two things together. But do not be afraid, we can tackle this. A different expression, especially one of anger or screaming like the one I'm drawing, deeply affects the face shape. This is because our faces are mobile, especially in the jaw area. So when the mouth opens, you have to account for the triangle part of the face to lengthen. The overall mass of the face doesn't grow, it's not like our faces get bigger. The volume is maintained because as the jaw lengthens, it also gets slimmer on the sides, as your cheeks are more stretched out and more hollow. Go check that in the mirror if you don't believe me. In this particular expression, the eyebrows are coming down in a frown and the eyes are closed shut in anger. So, of course, the circle, the top area of the head will also be squashed. As you can see, when you change expression, the relation between the three basic areas of the face will also alter slightly. This is not to say that your character will be unrecognizable, the difference in ratio will depend on how extreme the expression is. Okay, so now for the final part, the cleanup. This is the moment where we can make sure that the likeness is enhanced thanks to the individual shape of each feature. When you're creating a new character, it's good practice to make a note of each feature and think about what its exact shape is. You don't have to create an art bible for each new character, especially if you don't plan to make it a recurrent thing, but it's still a good idea to do this if you know you'll have to replicate the character a few times. In this stage, I like to push my shapes a bit more, make them more unique, more recognizable. This is the moment where you can think about references, aesthetics, add stylistic quirks that will make your character special. The more you make your character special, the more its features are drawn in a specific way that you can easily replicate because you intimately understand how it's made, the workflow that it takes you to draw that specific shape, the more your character will be recognizable and easier to draw in any pose that you can think of. For this character, for example, the most distinctive feature is, in my opinion, the fact that the style is quite flat and the line art very decisive and clean. The eyes are almond-shaped and characterized by neat, upturned, pointy lashes. The nose is just a flat line with the nose holes sitting on top. The hair is just strings and the mouth is an oval with a little dot in the middle. By defining these shapes as rather cartoony, I'm making my life easier because they are going to be easier to replicate across various poses. And that's it. Here's a quick character sheet for a random OC. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and please let me know if you found it useful or if you still have more doubts or basically any comment at all. I really care about your opinion, guys. As usual, thanks for watching and supporting my art. Bye!